Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you, LinkedIn, for hosting us, and specifically Tatiana. Before I even start, I want to say why LinkedIn and Translation Commons are very, very closely related. Translation Commons started in 2014 when I wrote a blog on LinkedIn, and it had an immense response. So that prompted me to do a LinkedIn group. And in 20 days, that LinkedIn group had 1,000 people. So thank you, LinkedIn, for providing us that platform that we could gather together as a community. We gave our first presentation about 2 years ago in IMUG, and it was at the LinkedIn offices. And here we are, nearly 2 years later, wanting to share with you our news and a couple of breakthroughs and a couple of important things. And here we are again at LinkedIn. So we go close together, and thank you so much again. So here we are to talk about the International Year of Indigenous Languages. So as far as 2016, the UN declared 2019 to be the International Year of Indigenous Languages. So the main facilitator is UNESCO. Along with UNESCO, it's in collaboration with a lot of the UN agencies and UN partners. Along is another 11 governmental partners, and there are 22 social civil society partners. And you can see that is a screenshot from the UNESCO website. Translation Commons is a social civil society partner. So why Indigenous languages? You can see on the website of International Year of Indigenous Languages all the information. It's got so much information, it's pages and pages, and honestly, it's all very, very great information. But I want to share with you something that brought it home for me, and maybe it'll bring it home for you. Sometimes I would hear that, all this indigenous language cannot be lost, and it's very important to us. But it was an example that actually brought it back. There's an African language, and in this language, they have about 50 plants that are in the vicinity in that corner of the world. And those 50 plants are not named according to our botanical taxonomy as we know it, but they're named for their usage. And that usage can be good for fish bait, good for pest control, good for this, bad for that. And that gives the people, that naming of that plant gives the people the understanding of what the plant can be used for. Well, can you imagine if all our plants were named like that, what it would mean to biotechnology today? So this is knowledge, ecological knowledge, that if we don't preserve these countries, we're going to lose this information. The main objectives of the International Year of Indigenous Languages are first to create awareness. And because of that, a lot of the campaigns are designed to create that awareness. But along the way, it is preparing for action plans and for all sorts of projects that are going to come over the next 2 years and the next decade that will introduce all sorts of capacity enabling to these indigenous communities. I want to ask the same question now. Why indigenous languages? I asked it before and I gave you, the example of the plants. But let's look at it from an economical point of view. So the International Telecommunications Union is saying in 2018, they have estimated and published a report that says that 10% of increase in the penetration of digital services is in a country, they can expect a 1.3% increase in GDP per capita. That is an amazing amount, okay? There are some success stories. For example, Singapore is one of the success stories that the GDP increased by digitization. Another point, by 2022, there's going to be the next billion users online. It is going to happen. It is happening as we speak. And in Africa, for example, 60% of young people are not online. And in other countries, the same thing. Well, there are a lot of efforts right now to bring all these young people online. So Translation Commons is a social civil society partner. And as such, we sat together with UNESCO to agree on some projects that we're going to work through the year. So we started with the language technology development, and Craig is going to tell you a lot more about it. We agreed on the university events for Indigenous languages, and Mila is going to tell you a lot more about it. And finally, every partner of UNESCO in the International Year had to have a social media campaign because the whole idea of this year is awareness. And Johanna is going to tell you about the great successes we had with the social media campaign. But before I pass it on, I want to say to you today that we have some important things to share and a couple of breakthroughs that we're going to share along the way. And I also wanted to remind you that Translations Commons mission, motto, vision, whatever you want to call it, is no language and no linguist should be left behind. So with that, I'm going to pass on to Craig Cornelius, who's going to talk to us about the language technology development.
Is this on? It is.
Yes.
Do I?
Your clicker.
I have to use two hands for this. Okay. We'll see what happens. I'm Craig Cornelius. I work at Google, and I've been at Google 12 years. And I had the great fortune to interact with my first Indigenous community about 10 years ago in the Cherokee Nation. And that has led to some amazing things. I'll get to that a little bit more in a few minutes. But I want to tell you about the languages of the world. There's incredible diversity in the world. About 6,500 to 7,000 languages are estimated to be spoken in the world. Nobody knows for sure. But 50% of the world's people speak only 23 of them. So that means that the tail of long languages is very long, and 2,000 of these languages are spoken by 1,000 or fewer people. That means that a lot of languages don't have a lot of the resources that we commonly expect to be in a major language, a major European language, a major Asian language, a major African language. And of those 6,500 to 7,000 languages, perhaps 40% of them are endangered and may not exist by the end of this century. And that is a tragedy for lots of reasons, not least of which those languages contain a lot of knowledge about what there is in the environment where these people speak these languages, but also culturally, when a person loses a language, or when people lose their language, they lose a lot more. They lose their culture, they lose their history, they lose their self-respect. Their children lose a part of what it means to be them, and very many people get lost in that loss of language. Now, digital technology, which we're all involved in one way or another, is a great benefit to this, in the sense that it gives the possibility of taking every language that's available now and make recordings of it, makes it easier for people to document these languages, makes it easier for people to use these languages. But of course, it's also a threat, because the dominant languages in every country around the world are used by many, many more people. Therefore, there's a lot more content, and it's much harder for these small language communities to even find other people who speak the languages when they move to big cities. I visited Cameroon back in 2001, and I was told at that time that about 250 languages were spoken in that country. I spoke to someone a few years later, and he says many of these are dying out because the people move to the cities. They can't find their communities. They might find a few people who speak that language, but they don't teach their children. Why? Because the children see no use in it when they're in the big cities, and going back to their villages is the only time the elders communicate in that language. And so these languages are not getting into the modern world and maybe disappearing. Now, we're going to talk about language technology tonight, and we're talking about developing language technologies for the many languages which are not being supported by major companies right at this time. We hope that Indigenous languages will use the technologies just as English and Russian and Chinese and many other languages use right now to keep their preferred languages going, keep people speaking them, keep people using them, and help them to use them in everyday life, more than just speaking with the grandparents or the grandparents speaking among each other. We especially hope that young learners will learn to appreciate their own languages and will see that there is value in not only talking with their parents and grandparents, but talking to each other. My model of a success in a language is when the young people in the language are busy texting each other in that language and lying to their parents about where they're really going after school. If that is the case, then the language may be different a little bit from what the parents spoke, but it's still going to be used because we know that if young people stop speaking the language, then the language is going to disappear. We want to educate people, and we need to educate them in their own languages, which means we need to have ways that people can use language materials and develop language materials for their languages. And we want to urge people to create new content, because the more content there is out there in terms of written material, audio, video material, the more excited people will be about their language, the more people will realize that their language is important to themselves and their communities. So what we did is create a guideline for language communities. We hope that this will help people discover, A, that their languages can be used with the new digital technologies, and B, practical steps to do this. We don't know if this has ever been written down anywhere before. It was in a lot of people's heads, but we have put together a written guideline which we hope will be used by Indigenous peoples and their advocates to bring people online in many different forms with their languages and thus help preserve those languages. So someone will be able to evaluate her language to see, is it at a stage where it can be made digital, or if not, what needs to be done to get it to that point? We want to suggest some actual approaches to that. We want to encourage practical use. We're not so much interested in developing documentation that linguists would develop in a research environment. We want people to actually be able to use their languages online. How do people use their languages? They speak to each other, they text to each other, they blog, they write social messages or social media messages. And that's the kind of use we're talking about, not formal, this is the right way to use this language. Because in many of these cases, there is no documented way to use it. And quite honestly, language changes fast. My children, who are in their 20s, speak a very different form of English than I do, and I know that that is accelerating. We want to engage the communities as well. If it's just individuals who are doing this thing, it's great, but if communities themselves are working together, even greater things will happen. And connecting these communities to existing standards will make it easier for them to do things than for them to have to develop everything themselves. So what we're not trying to do is develop something that will be a set of formal requirements. There is no list of thou shalts and thou shalt nots in this document, but suggestions. We're also not doing an academic research project. We won't find that this is going to be something that professors of linguistics are going to be adopting as their roadmap, but they surely may use it as ways of engaging people who do speak Indigenous languages. And it's not complete. We surely don't know everything that can be done. And we're not sure that everything that can be done will be applicable to every language. But as the quote from John Steinbeck says so eloquently there in the rather imperfect typing, that you don't have to be perfect to do something that's really important. And as a friend of mine in the Unicode community often states, Mark Davis, the perfect is often the enemy of the good. And so we don't strive for perfection here. What have we done? We've tried to build a flowchart. Basically, this came out of the idea that there are some decision points that people need to work with. For example, people need to ask themselves, how is my language actually used? Is it used only in oral form, or is it used in a written form? Is my language documented or not? So we developed a set of questions, yes or no questions, and built a flowchart. And by following this flowchart, people can evaluate where they are. Then they can see, if I'm at this stage with my language and I really want it to be in use on the digital media that are available, these are some next steps that may be possible to do. Some of them they can do themselves. Some of them they may need to engage with technology companies or people who are maybe not in the technology companies but still fluent with building web pages. with developing keyboards, with making fonts, all of which can be done by individuals these days. It is specific, and it says if you do this, then you can go on to the next stage. We also have pointers to lots of resources, but the pointers to resources and tools are very incomplete. We know that we only know of a few things, and that's why we're hoping that you will take this seriously and give us ideas about more resources that we can add to this. And there are all suggestions for next steps. So if a group of people has certain capabilities, we suggest that they might develop these things as well. And we'll try to be more specific starting here. For example, one of the questions is the language currently being used in a community? And that's really important because we are focusing on languages that are still being spoken primarily, but some languages are disappearing very fast, and it may be less of a language continuation project and more of a revitalization project, in which case different things need to be considered. And revitalization is not something that I know much about, but there are people who do. And to answer some questions about revitalization requires, or those questions, asking and giving some answers about what the next steps for that are, may be helpful to people who want to do that. That's a big job, but we have to ask the question. Then we ask, is the language written or not? And if it is, we send you to the box that says written language. Otherwise, we give you directions to the box that says oral language, and we have details under each one of those as to some of the next steps. I'm not going to go through the whole flowchart here, of course, because that would take us till next Tuesday, but at least if we discussed it in great detail. But I do want to say something about oral language. I am not an expert in dealing with languages that do not have a written form, but it is very obvious to almost anyone that there's a lot of language out there in terms of audio and video that doesn't necessarily have to have a written form. There are tons of videos about people not only using language, but trying to teach others their language, and they don't have to be written for people to be able to pass this on. But there are challenges with that because many people will think, oh, my language isn't one of the ones supported in the user interface, so I can't use it to teach my language. So to encourage people to use these resources and think about them slightly different way may encourage more use of their oral-only languages. But there is a challenge with that. There are probably lots of videos out there on several different platforms that are dealing with languages that are not dominant languages. But how does one identify them? The platforms should come up with ways of letting the users, the people who are uploading videos and audio, to be able to identify that this is a particular language so that other people can identify it, other people can find it. Because right now, finding a language in YouTube or other platforms may be tricky because the language name may have been typed in by somebody in one language, in French perhaps, and someone speaking German may not be able to find that. Or perhaps it was put in by a Russian speaker, but someone in China might not be able to find that because they don't know the name that was used. So there are things that can perhaps help with that. There are schemes for identifying languages. BCP 47 is a standard for using standard language tags that identify a language without having the human word for it, but a series of two or three letters to identify the language. So somebody has to write something somewhere for people to find these things, but oral languages can be documented as well and used. Now the written languages, approximately 4,000 of them are out there, and we need to talk a little bit about what a writing system is. Some of you may have noticed I and a few others in the group have two tags tonight, not only the LinkedIn tag, but a Unicode conference tag. And Unicode is the standard for writing world's languages. Almost all of the important scripts that people use to write things have already been encoded into Unicode, and the ones that aren't are either in process or are are definitely candidates to be included into the Unicode standard. It does take effort, it does take work, it does take time, but the written languages can be represented in standards. There's plenty of room in the Unicode space for all the human languages. when we invent or when we have technology that communicates with other civilizations off of this planet, then we might have to expand Unicode a bit, but we're not going to worry about that tonight. So writing systems are very important, and standards for writing them are very, very useful. Unicode is the one that we recommend. Why? Because it works, and it's in place in almost every platform now. After we ask if people have a writing system, and it may not just be one writing system, it's really important to note that some languages have been written in 2 or 3 or more. For example, languages of Central Asia were originally perhaps written in Arabic, or maybe even a script before the Arabic script became dominant in their area. And then when the Soviet Union was in place, Cyrillic was a pretty popular one. And then after the demise of the Soviet Union, people have gone to other scripts, including Latin scripts and Mongolian script and so on. So multiple scripts for a language is not unusual, but if they're in Unicode already, it works fine. So we ask some follow-up questions. It is useful to ask people to consider, is my language somewhat standardized or is used consistently? Why is that important? Well, there are some languages, such as Native American groups, which differ from reservation to reservation, and they actually have different ways of typing exactly the same words, but they use different characters. And so deciding whether your language is one language that is codified in a particular way, or if it's codified in a different way, it should be considered a different language. There are ways of representing not only the language, but also the writing system that's being used for it. And that's really important and useful for people to consider when they're deciding how to use their language with modern media. My example of getting started with Indigenous languages is not something that Google asked me to do, but I by chance met someone from the Cherokee Nation. And that person said, when I asked him about his name, Black Fox was the family name, he said, that's my tribal name. He asked me what I did, and he said, oh, I've got to connect you with my cousin in Oklahoma. And we started a relationship with the Cherokee Nation and actually translated Google search and then later Gmail into the Cherokee language. The user interfaces are available there. Is that really important? No, it wasn't terribly important in terms of the number of people who actually use these languages. But what it did do is get the communities behind the effort to do the translation. And the little kids who were in the immersion schools for Cherokee started talking with the elders. And the elders started talking with the little kids. How should we translate these terms? Now, when Cherokee was originally developed as a written language 200 years ago by a man from the Cherokee Nation named Sequoyah, and yes, it is related to the name of the tree, Sequoyah called books that he saw the Westerners using talking leaves. And that's very poetic and beautiful. They had to come up with a term for email when they were translating these terms. And they came up with a term which in English translation means lightning paper. That's what email means in the Cherokee language. My wife heard that and said, oh my gosh, you have to help this language be preserved because it is beautiful. It's poetic. And in fact, the people within the Cherokee Nation who I work with in the language department are often artists as well as linguists. And the Cherokee happen to be very advanced. They've always been interested in adopting new technologies. They had the first telephone west of the Mississippi River in the Cherokee Nation. They also developed keyboards, and some of you may remember the Selectric typewriter with the type balls. They didn't make very many of them, but they worked in Cherokee just fine. They've also developed many fonts and web font technology, and they have proceeded to work with companies to build keyboards and other tools on modern platforms, including mobile devices. In our document, we have pointers to these tools, not only tools that are publicly available, but tools that are in open source so people can actually build new tools on the basis of this. And this includes things like building keyboards for mobile devices and building new fonts. So how do we standardize? Well, I've mentioned Unicode and I promoted Unicode and I like Unicode. Unicode pays my bills in some sense. Language tags. It's real easy to say, oh, I'll just invent a tag for my language. I'll call my language, I'll give a tag that would be just the name of the language based on the first two letters of the way I call it in English. Well, that works fine, but there are standard codes, and you should use these. Why? Because the systems that are busy indexing websites and videos and other media out there don't know your made-up tag, don't know your made-up code. So PT might mean Portuguese, but it could also mean Portuguese in Brazil or Portuguese in Iberia. So you need to use not only the language PT or the code PT, but PT with the appropriate region if you want to distinguish Brazilian from Iberian Portuguese, which are very different. And German is DE because, of course, Deutsch. And ZH is Chinese, but there are variations on that with the script. Does anyone know what the code EU stands for? Yeah, you got it. Which is the language in English? It's the Basque language, yes. And so that wouldn't have been something that I would have thought of, but EU is one of those. Anybody know the code for Albanian? SQ. Why? Because it works in Albanian, from what I understand. Although I may be wrong on that. Unicode support, if you want to learn about Unicode and getting things into the Unicode standard, if a script is not already encoded, there's lots of information about it. But I urge people who are working with Indigenous languages, if there is a script that the language uses already, don't invent a new one. Why? Because it's going to take years to get a new invented script into the standards, into the mobile devices, into fonts, into keyboards. So if an existing script works, use that. Otherwise, there are ways to get information in there. Another part of the Unicode world is called the Common Locale Data Repository, CLDR, and that is a way for people to put additional information, not just about their writing system, but about their language into it. So in CLDR, there is, a way of thinking about it is that Unicode emphasizes scripts. The Latin script supports lots of different languages, from Swahili to Afrikaans, to English, to Mongolian, actually. And these writing systems are not specific to languages, but CLDR data is specific. So in CLDR, there's information for a particular language in things like, how do you say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and so on? How do you say January, February, March, April? How do you represent the calendar in your language and in your country? And so the CLDR repository has data that's very useful when you want to get down to languages as opposed to scripts. And again, there are processes for adding things to this standard as well that we've outlined in our document. Now, there are examples of communities that are doing the work. I won't go through this in great detail, but I picked these three because they're almost equidistant around the world. The Cherokee in Oklahoma, the Fufulde or Pular people or speakers in Africa, which is all along the southern edge of the Sahara Desert, the Sahel, and Chakma, a small community in Bangladesh, all have worked to get their writing systems into Unicode, and we've worked with them to get keyboards, and they have worked with us to develop fonts and use fonts that companies have prepared. And now these are all available on modern mobile devices, and they are all working hard on educational and outreach efforts within their communities to increase the use of their language. There's other things that people use with language, of course, beyond just basic keyboards and fonts and standards. People want to do all sorts of things with their languages. And it's something you never think about, but when you see text on a device and then you turn the device sideways and the text reformats and the line breaks are in different places because the lines are longer or shorter, it works in most languages. But that's not obvious without code underneath that actually tells where's the end of a line or where is it possible to break things. And that works even for languages such as Chinese or Burmese that do not have spaces between their words. That's all part of code. That isn't necessarily going to happen magically when a new language is added, so it may require additional work. And detecting what a language is. If I see a bunch of Latin text, without some analysis, the computer can't tell whether that's Swahili or Danish. And so language detection may require some additional work to be done. And dictionaries require additional work, including user interfaces that are translated into languages, That's additional work and sometimes requires a company to cooperate. And additional things. But all of these things are not necessary for people to begin using their languages online. Just in the bottom part, the CLDR data can be used to further refine how people will use their language. And one example is what kinds of digits people use. The people who speak Tamil often use Tamil digits. They use different digits in different parts of Arabia. Some places use the Western ASCII digits. Some places use different digits. And Farsi speakers even use a third kind of digit. So there are many different forms of data that are specific to languages. Not necessary to use your language in basics, but it can be added as people get more sophisticated. We also have to worry about right to left versus vertical versus left to right directions. And all this data can be added once people get started on the process of using their languages with digital technology. There are things which are a lot harder. And when I said I don't guarantee that this guideline is going to let everybody use all the language tools available, this is the level at which things become a lot harder. Optical character recognition of ancient texts or even modern texts to get them into digital form doesn't happen without specialized processing. And speech to text and text to speech. Siri is not going to be speaking to you in those in more than a couple hundred languages anytime soon. Why? Because it normally takes a huge amount of data to do speech to text, text to speech, and automated speech recognition. Automated transcription of all those tapes that linguists have generated over many, many years of field work. That takes specialized work as well. And finally, machine translation, sort of the holy grail, so to speak, of language, isn't going to be available for language with 2,000 speakers anytime soon. Why? There isn't enough data to train our existing speech models. But the good news is that people are generating open source and publicly available projects to do just that with some of these things. One can go online and find optical character recognition engines that you can train yourself, and you can use your own data to start generating OCR. Likewise, with speech to text and the other advanced things, they're starting to become available to people who are non-specialists. It still takes computers, it still takes some technical expertise, but it doesn't take a major technology company to do it. So do-it-yourself language is indeed starting to become a reality. So what Translation Commons is doing with this small team of people here and people who are connecting with the website is that we're excited and excited about this and trying to provide people with the information and some of the expertise that they need and the connections that they may be able to use to do some of these things on their own and connect with people who can help them do the things that may not be able to be done by the indigenous communities themselves. We have the document online. It's under translationcommons.org. Follow your links and you'll get to the current state of the document, but we need help with it. As I said, it isn't complete. We don't know what we don't know, and perhaps you do. And help us connect people with indigenous communities. If you know someone who speaks a language that maybe could use this but isn't represented well with digital technologies, let them know about this. And perhaps we can connect them with the right people who can start making that a reality. So it's important to realize that although language technology isn't where we'd like it to be for every language, for many, it may be closer than you think. Just like the rearview mirror, you have to be careful because the way technology is going, some of these things may be online faster than we expect. And next, Ludmila.
Works. Impressive, isn't it? I'm very impressed. Amazing document. So language holds the soul of a nation. How many of you guys here in the room are from somewhere else, from another country? Okay. And how many of your parents came from another country or grandparents? And how many of your homes speak more than one language? So pretty impressive. We're all a very diverse group, but guess what? That today is very, very representative of the way the whole world has become. Before, we were very separated. We all lived in our own village, and now we live in this amazing world where we're all together, except for the communities that speak indigenous languages. So how do we find them? How do we reach out to those communities? It's like trying to call somebody on the phone, except they don't have a phone line. They don't even know we exist. And we were trying to do a Women in Localization event in Houston with an organization called Station Houston, which is a bunch of technology startups to promote the industry, and realized that in Houston, Texas, in the industry, people don't know the word localization. They think it is some kind of a real estate term. And then when we try to expand that, they thought it was some kind of a term from the biology industry, because we have a big medical center next door. And I was floored, because I was thinking, oh my God, we think we exist, but nobody knows about us, right? So how do we spread the information? How do we know indigenous community, people in indigenous communities, or like some other organizations called emerging markets, that we exist? They don't even know who we are. So as a first step, we wanted to reach out to the communities through, there's always 6 degrees of separation, and we wanted to reach out through university events. So the partnership came up with the UNESCO program of indigenous languages, and we were going to ask universities around the world to do classroom lectures, presentations to raise awareness of the indigenous languages. But the basis for this, once again, came with the power of one. And some people are still in this room. There was an idea about a year ago to create an exchange between different universities and professors, where professors are able to exchange lectures and be each other guest speakers in classrooms around the world. And guess what? Before we knew it, 40 universities signed up and wanted to be part of it. And then we were at the Localization Technology Roundtable, and some of the people in the room and recognized me, and they were speaking about, oh my God, we can never hire anybody who really knows, has the knowledge base that we need. We only have a couple universities, and MIS is one of these groups, and the students are pretty much hired before they graduate. And even then there is a gap, a knowledge gap. And so what do? And we said, let's organize an exchange of information between industry and universities, where the industry tells us what the needs are, and maybe become guest speakers, and maybe create some of the curriculum, and then universities adopt that worldwide. Great idea, the power of one. Well, let me tell you what the project has become. So the first step was gathering information, campaign creation, pilot, and then campaign launch. As you know, Translation Commons has no budget. So with a zero budget, who do we organize? We organize students. We reached out to the village school, which is part of the North Anglia schools. And once again, 22 countries, 66 schools. The 6 kids on this picture speak 6 different languages and represent 5 different continents. They did a lot of work this summer. Some of the interesting things that they learned is the absolute shortage of linguists. Human linguists are one of the fastest growing professions, growing by about 18% in the next few years, according to the US Labor Department. They also realized how many programs are there, how many professions are there for linguists. But the most important takeaway they learned is that there is 50 to 75 million children today who have no access to education. They don't even go to school. They can't go to school. Why? Education is not available in their native language. And I want you to visualize that number, 50 to 75 million children. They grow up, they have no economic opportunities because education is not available in their language. They grow up, they have kids, their kids have no economic opportunities. And also, kids learn better and understand information better when they learn in their native language. That was a very important takeaway and a very kind of deepening thought about the importance of this whole undertaking. No, we're not. Yes, we are trying to save that one language that maybe has two speakers, that maybe holds the key to the mysteries of this world. But at the same time, many of the communities have millions of speakers. The Mayan community, which is not online, has 6 million speakers. This is the result of the little summer project of the university students. We connected with 657 undergraduate and postgraduate programs worldwide. And those programs were interested to join and become part of it. In fact, we have a group in Zambia where we have very active group of 90 linguists who speak languages, very local languages, who are interested in how they can bring education to their communities in those languages. And that group's actually exploding. On my WhatsApp group is having lots and lots of messages every day. So it's amazing, the interest, and the reason for the interest is there is a need. So again, how do we reach out to universities? How do we reach out to those communities? We build awareness. So the first part was organizing the university events together with the efforts of UNESCO within the framework of the Year of Indigenous Languages. So Natalia Noland, who teaches languages at the Houston Community College, and she has one of the most very unique programs where they teach translation and interpreting language non-specific. So she has students coming to her program speaking African languages, Indian languages. Students from any language can come into her program and learn how to interpret and how to translate. So she got together with a task group of professors, and then they reached out to universities and academia that teach Indigenous languages and work with Indigenous languages. And together they first created a set of guidelines that were distributed and posted online to help those universities organize the events. Then they put together resources, videos, articles, blogs, websites, so that they provide content, because how do you know to organize something about what you don't know about, right? So content. And then they provided examples for how do you do a classroom event, how do you do a 3-hour workshop, how do you do a conference, full-day conference. They put together a lot of work and many hours in creating all of these documents and resources together. In addition to that, community managers and volunteers were available before, during, and after the events, and still available today, and also there to provide social media support. And first, it was done as a pilot project where 60 professors from different universities organized the events and provided feedback. That feedback was taken. The program was updated, materials were updated, and then the main campaign was launched where we were contacting those 650 universities worldwide, asking them to do the events as the first step, the awareness campaign. And we were reaching out to them through newsletters and social media. And the results are amazing. This is so far to date. This is the results of the combined campaign of UNESCO and the campaign organized by the Translation Commons. So the 650 universities that were also asked to share their information are part of these dots where the events have taken place. What does it tell us? The need is tremendous. So the next steps are the awareness campaign will be ongoing until the end of 2019. And if you do know of any university anywhere in the country, again, 6 degrees of separation, Caucasus Mountains, Lisgian language, any other country and location, please invite them to take part in this campaign. On November 26 and 27, UNESCO will be holding the meeting with the professors, and we'll be discussing the next steps together for global knowledge sharing and for global sharing of best practices. This all falls together with the UNESCO and Sustainable Development Goals of 2030, and guess what? None of these goals can be accomplished without language. none of this can be accomplished without communication, because when you log in online and your language is cliché and it's not there, the only thing you see is what maybe you and your brother posted, right? So we want to, through this campaign, help people that when they do come online, they actually have the same access to information as what we do. And next, Joanna will talk to us, or Johanna, correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
I need to
thank
perfect my. So Johanna will talk to us about the social media outreach.
Thank you, Mila. Before I get started, I would like to ask a question. So how many people in this room are typing text messages and social media posts in more than 2 languages? Yeah, just look around you. It's not very uncommon, in fact.
the other way.
Oh, the other way. Okay, so within the next 10 minutes, I want to talk about not only about the success of our campaign and reflect on the great results and the importance of the mission, but I hope that I can share some interesting findings that we made while executing this campaign. You can find our campaign, by the way, by following these hashtags that you see on the screen. But I would like to first kick off by introducing our amazing team of 9 volunteers, plus myself. And as Mila highlighted earlier, we did this all with 0 or close to 0 budget. We received a little bit of help from our friends from Facebook. But we reached about 200,000 people all over the world, which is, I think, quite amazing considering the minimal resources we had at hand. So could I now real quick ask the members of my team sitting today in the audience to stand up? So let's give them a quick round of applause. It's fantastic work, guys, and even considering that we worked over 3 time zones, it was sometimes hard to find meeting times, but we managed to pull together this global campaign, and we had amazing levels of engagement ranging from 6 to 10%. So how did we make this all happen with minimal resources? So I would like to start first from the content strategy part of our campaign. So we were thinking, of course, what would be the best way to start a conversation and what kind of content should we be sharing overall. And we didn't want this to be a cry out. Instead, we wanted to share a message of inspiration. And we divided the audience into 2 groups. The first one was the indigenous communities to themselves. We wanted to encourage them to see their own strength and see the success stories of successful language revitalization projects that they already had. And another group was the people just like you today, in the audience today. And we wanted to share with you the inspiring stories of the Shakma speakers who are, with the power of one, bringing their people online, and a story of Terry Yanke, an Aboriginal attorney who is rewriting the laws to protect the indigenous knowledge, which the profit from those inventions belong to the people who made them. But of course, we were ourselves very excited about the content and about the campaign, but we had to ask ourselves the question, is anybody else going to be interested? And I'm going to share an answer to this question shortly. But first, I want to throw a little teaser for you here in the audience. So as Greg mentioned earlier, we have about 3,000 languages that are in fully oral form today. And the other half of remaining languages, they are in a written form. So how many books are published today in the world? Just think about this number in your head. What could it be? And I'm going to share the answer with you. It's about 130 million, but this probably gives you a perspective of just about how much information we still have stored in those remaining half of the languages. Next I want to take you to a journey of discovery. So this is from the beginning of our campaign. We started with the general awareness campaign, and just to find out if the online audience would actually respond to the type of content that we were sharing, and to find out the answer to the question, is anybody interested? We had good numbers of engagement since the very early days of our campaign, which was, of course, very delightful. But the true growth hack actually was made when our very own team member, Sylvia, offered that she wanted to translate our ads on Brazilian, Portuguese, and Spanish. And I call this the part of our campaign when Sylvia exploited the internet. So we didn't receive only thousands of likes and views, but we received tens of thousands of views and thousands of engagements. And actually, our audience base is even growing today. So the campaign is definitely not over. We only discovered the first steps. Overall, I would say we managed to build a good size, strong and engaged audience, and we have solid ground for continuing with the future projects. For our marketing personnel out there, I wanted to break down some numbers about the audience demographics. So while a majority of our followers are still females, the group is otherwise very diverse. So we received the volumes and a good number of followers from all over the world. But I wanted to highlight a couple of surprising locations. We received actually good volumes from locations such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Bangladesh, which didn't come in my mind when we first got started. But okay, hey, welcome, guys. And to come back to the question, so is anybody interested? We actually ran a small side project about social listening to find out what kind of conversation was already out there. So we used the TweetDeck tool. We had 6 members of our team tracking the ongoing online conversation based on the keyword list of 40 keywords with good search volumes that we identified by using Google Trends and other available tools. And what we actually found out that there was already active conversation out there. It wasn't moderated by us. It wasn't moderated by UNESCO. It was already out there. People are talking about this topic. They are interested. And I just want to sum up. I told you that we did the initial keyword research. So we were able to identify 40 keywords around the world that have good volumes of search queries each month. So just to give you an idea, a keyword per Indigenous people receives about 33,000 worldwide searches each month. And this study we did was fully in American English. So I just want to take you into consideration that we didn't even include the local languages. And this is actually the discovery. How I would summarize our campaign was that we were following the small streams and we ended up discovering the river, and now we are speeding up to discover the ocean. And this is actually a good point to hand over to Janet, who is going to talk more about our future initiatives.
Well, thanks very much. you share in a minute, huh? Okay. So what's next? Well, first, before we go to what's next, I want to share about the breakthrough of what we have accomplished today in just 6 months, because the team of experts that put together Zero to Digital created a unique, unprecedented situation. This information was in the brains of people and never written before. So now these wonderful experts got together and actually documented everything for everybody else. Yes, it's the first steps, but I want to say a great thank you to Craig Cornelius, Craig Cummings, Deborah Anderson, and Lee Collins, who's not here with us. And this is just the core team. There are other people like Mette and Andrew Owen, Johanna, Esther, a lot of people, Lawrence, a whole team of people that have helped create this document. So thank you very much. This has been unique. It's one of the breakthroughs I spoke earlier. Now we can build on that. The second thing I want to say is that what we have done here, you have gathered from everyone that it's just the beginning. And as we were working with all these projects, we realized not just that this is the beginning, but the task is so huge in front of us. And yet, it's not undoable. Look what we did in 6 months. Out of nothing. We did it with passion and with our own free time. And yes, we did it. So we can do more. We can do what's ahead of us because we're the experts. We're the community that can actually help everybody here. So yes, on the one hand, we have the immediate steps of what UNESCO is going to do in the next few years that we are already part of this partnership with the International Year. But there's not just that, there is more to come. And before we go into what we have in mind and share with you a little bit, we want to share with you some figures that Johanna will share with us.
Okay. Thank you, Jeanette. So I collected together this short report just to give you the idea of the scale of the opportunity that we have in our hands. So let me take you to a journey through India and Africa, and let's first have a closer look at the Indian continent. So just think about a very population-dense area, just like the islands of Japan, suddenly all at once jumping into new technology. And this is exactly what is happening in India today when it comes to smartphones. In fact, India is one of the rapidly growing mobile phone markets, and average user there types in at least 4 keyboards, and at least 2 of those 4 keyboards are in local languages. And while internet is growing very fast in India, there are still nearly 900 million people, so imagine entire Europe being plugged out of internet. That's the size of the problem we have with Indian internet user base. So one of the main barriers for adoption is identified to be English as the main user language. And this is actually something that the local providers have already realized as a market gap, and they are competing now very aggressively with the Western mobile providers by localizing into local languages, which is probably interesting to know if you plan a market entry in India. So I took Africa as a comparison point because it's another very rapidly growing mobile market, and it has similar kind of problems with the internet user adoption rate because English as a user interface language is preventing people, actually 460 million people who are already covered by broadband. So imagine the population of South America accessing the internet content. So they have actually chosen not to use the available internet connection. This is because Africa is actually culturally very diverse. Africa speaks about 2,000 languages, and we cannot expect that they want to learn another dominant language and abandon their own culture. So despite all the challenges, African economy is still growing very fast. In fact, internet is expected to contribute with about $300 billion to the local economy within next decade. But just think about how this number could look like if we would bring the remaining half of the Africans online. And so, as you can see, we still have a lot of work to do and also great potential for this project. And this is a good point to hand back to Jeanette, who is going to tell about our future initiatives.
Thank you very much. So, you can see the task that's ahead of us. And what would the world be like if we were to have all languages online? And there are some projects out there, like UNICEF's Giga project is designed to have every single school in the world be connected online. The Broadband Commission, for example, says that in 2 years' time, 75% of the world will be connected. They are all talking, including corporations, about 100% connectivity within the next few years. So at that point, we got a little bit their attention, and we asked them, in what language? And that got their attention. Now, this is particularly of interest to all of us, because how many times, how many years, how many decades have we tried to get their attention? And we hadn't. So this time, we got their attention based on the fact that we have a breakthrough document that we can give it to them and show black and white, this is what it takes for a language to be digitized. So they're starting to understand that not connectivity alone is going to bring internet to everybody, but it's going to be hand in hand with our efforts as a language community that we're going to help all of these indigenous languages, all the languages in the world, to digitize, to be online. We're going to support them. So you saw this slide before. It was discussed by Craig when he was explaining the language technology development for this particular year. So from the beginning, we set out those objectives, as he has mentioned. And one by one, they're all extremely current. I have added to his slide the last point, which is create job opportunities. Now, if you remember, when Miller was talking about the universities and about all these people, there were jobs created. People wanted to translate, or was it Craig actually saying it? I'm sorry. And people wanted to translate their language. Translation is a portal. It's the way of each community to be able to share their knowledge if they want to. If they don't want to, that's okay. But if they do want to, they will translate. And the same way, by translating into our languages, we're going to share with them their rich heritage. And creating these job opportunities is something we can easily do because the Translation Commons platform is designed particularly to help this professional enrichment. So think about the bigger picture. What would it be like for a world where all people have equal opportunities because they have the ability to be online in their own language? And that is an immense vision that we can all work together. So moving forward, not only we have agreed to do certain things, but we're taking now these objectives that we have put together and we are adapting them in such a way that they would fit in with the broader agency's objectives. And they say that in 3 years' time, internet is going to be in 152 countries. Well, in 3 years' time, we, as Translation Commons, as language community, need to make sure that these languages in those 152 countries are going to be supported digitally. And we can do it. Now, it won't take just 1 or 2 or 3 groups together. It's going to take a lot. So we've already started working towards that. There are various programs that involve students. For example, the Enactus program. We're already talking with Enactus. It's a university program which is global. And we are already talking with one university. The one is going to bring the 2 and the 3. But all these students are going to have teams of 8 with a project manager, and each of them is going to take on 1 or 2 languages. They're going to help reach out to the communities. They're going to be able to work with them and help them and give them access to the experts, to the companies, to the organizations that are going to make this happen for them. And this is just the beginning because we're going to move further and give them those educational contexts that they need in their local universities, how to create linguistically all the information that's required for their language to be taught properly, not just by schools elementary, but all the way through the entire education system. We're going to put them in touch, and we're also going to help them learn how to translate, create those job opportunities for them. So the vision is big, and the aim is great for the world. So I hope you'll be able to join us. In the very next few months, we're going to be looking to scale this, pilot. So if you think that this last 6 months was a proof of concept, now we've got to get down to work. So we need all of you to come on board and help us scale this. So thank you very much. And any questions, please? Thanks. Yes. Okay.
You like to talk.
Hi all, thank you so much. That was amazing. I'm so proud and I'm so impressed and excited to help and volunteer, whatever. But I was wondering if I can get the permission to translate the document and post it in Arabic language in my social media, if you don't mind. Can we do that? Thank you.
I'll give you my card.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'll volunteer anything in Arabic, localization as well.
It takes a village to make it happen. And eventually this document will need to be translated into all 7,000 languages.
Amazing. Cool.
And it's going to be a big,
So
big
excited.
community project. So thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Hold on.
Anybody else? Any other language? Anybody else wants to translate?
Well, not translate, but I do have a question about the social media campaign, if I could. There was a section in there about getting the temperature of current conversation on localization that talked about there being like 40 keywords that you were looking for. And I'm just curious, how did you choose, what was the distribution for languages for the keywords that you were working against? And is there perhaps maybe a bigger community if we expand that further? Though, of course, Twitter is kind of Western-centric.
Yeah, sure. So Twitter is, of course, only one of the many social media tools. We mostly chose it because Twitter has an amazing tool called TweetDeck that is fully freely accessible. But if anybody knows contacts from Hotsuite or Brandwatch and knows how to connect them with us, like, please help us out, because this is something we should study much more. But the distribution between the keywords, it was actually varying, and I don't think it gives a correct picture about where the traffic is coming from, since all we did was American English. But we received traffic for those keywords in quite surprising locations, such as Tanzania and Bangladesh and some parts of India. And I was actually looking forward to see results only in the English-speaking part of the world. But it seems like someone is looking, and we should go out there and reach towards them.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, and as I'm walking, if you can all engage your LinkedIn communities to reach out to the world. Got a question? I'm here for a forced question.
Here, we got one here.
Okay.
Hi, this question is actually for Craig, or more directly towards Craig. So you mentioned for the Cherokee nation and language that I think you were able to get in touch with a single person, and that kind of led on to more contacts. But did you find that for Native American languages, any resistance to having outsiders come in and try to document and also revitalize their language?
That's a very good question. The Cherokee are an especially good place to start with languages because they've always been interested in technology. They invented one of the first Native American written languages themselves. They didn't adopt Latin characters, for example. So they've always been interested in technology, and for them to actually initiate the contact with me was very exciting. And so there was very little objection from the Cherokee folks with us starting to work together. I had to change my style, which is rather, I'm not a quiet person, and speaking with people who are more reticent to speak in a group, I found that working with the Cherokee, I had to be a little quieter. But they have also been very helpful. They've connected me with some other communities. For example, the Osage Nation, which has about 250 to 300 speakers of the language. They introduced me to them, and with that group, we've been able to do basic things like getting fonts, keyboards, and now they can use that language on their mobile devices. However, the Osage Nation has not provided lists of words as the Cherokee have. So Cherokee keyboards now have predictive text because the Cherokee are very happy for their language to be used. The Osage folks are still debating among themselves whether they want their words to be known by the wider community, and so they don't have predictive text, and that's perfectly fine with them. I've tried to engage some other communities, and some communities have given no answer at all, and others have been been hesitant to make much progress. So it varies a lot. Some of these groups, I think, have sort of given up hope, and we hope that our work will energize and help raise up people who are excited about keeping their languages alive, especially among the young people. One of the things that one of my Cherokee contacts said at first was, if you get the cool things to the kids, they will start using Cherokee. So texting Cherokee is one of the key things that they wanted to do. Getting a keyboard and a font into the phone was actually the biggest challenge. With my friends in Africa, they wanted their writing system, the ADLAM writing system, on their phones because texting is so much cheaper than making phone calls. They were to the point where they were actually handwriting things in their right to left script and taking pictures of those and texting them with the picture because that's still cheaper than making phone calls. Now that they can start using keyboards and SMS, they are having a ball. The limit there is how fast phones that support the font are coming out in Africa. So does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Okay, well, thank you very much. There is a question? Okay.
Thank you. I'm curious about the purpose of the project. Is it to make sure that people have equal opportunities in their own language, or to record the indigenous languages online so they can pass it on?
It's very interconnected. So if you are, and there are some statistics, and Mila knows them by heart, but if somebody is able to speak in their own language or be online on their own languages, the opportunities increase. They are able to use it a lot better. And Singapore, yeah, go.
I'll give you an example of Singapore. Some years back, the average income in Singapore was less than in sub-Saharan deserts. The reason today in Singapore the average income is 20% higher than in the United States is because they're considered on the crossroads of economic trade. Now, every little community can be on those crossroads through access to the digital world. So every small community can suddenly become a powerful, even city nation, and not all of them are very, very big communities. At the same time, some languages may not want to be digitized in that form, but for those languages, it'll be important to preserve their history and their knowledge through digitization. So I guess the answer to the question is both.
You understand how they're interconnected, that we provide support for them to be able to use the internet in their own language, and that opens up a portal for opportunities, whether that's education, whether that's professional jobs, or whether it is selling goods. Whatever it is, if their language is not on the internet, they can't do it to the world. They can only do it within their own community.
But how do you define indigenous languages? I was wondering if a dialect can be an indigenous language.
So an indigenous language, according to dictionary, is any language which is local. Okay, so for example, in Germany, Bavarian is an indigenous language. Now, we would never consider Bavarian to be a language of indigenous people or aboriginals, let's say. So in our minds, when we hear the word indigenous, we always think of poor communities at the back of beyond, but that's not the case. An indigenous language can be in the middle of Europe.
I would give an example. There are 4 languages that are national languages of Switzerland: Italy, French, German, and also Romansh. Romansh probably has in the order of 20 to 30,000 speakers, but because it is a recognized language in Switzerland, there is support for it in a way that languages which are not official languages of any country, they don't have that support. For example, the Fufulde or Pular language, is spoken in 24 countries, but it's not official in any of those. And so any effort to do education or publication or any kind of work in that language requires the people themselves to do it because the governments have no support for it. So I'd say indigenous languages, one definition would be an indigenous language is a language that's not an official language of a national state. That would be one way of doing it. And almost every country in the world has at least one or more indigenous languages. For example, the country of Bhutan. It has fewer people than the city of San Francisco, but there are between 15 and 18 languages there. And only one of them, well, actually two of them are written. The one that's written that belongs there is Dzanga, and there are keyboards and fonts available for that. And the other language, which is taking over because the other 15 or 16 aren't written at all, is English. But if those indigenous languages that are not written could find an expression and support, maybe they would survive and not be driven out by the dominance of English.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but I have another question. Oh,
Sure.
Oh, what if the people that say that indigenous language, but they are educated and can talk in a official language that is used online and can use the technology? So is it still worth to do something for their indigenous language, since they already have an official language that can be used in technology?
Well, I'm taking out of your question, if a person speaks more than one language and one of those languages is readily available online and has good support, is it important to do something for their other language? And the answer is, if those people who speak that smaller language, or the language which is spoken by fewer people, think it's important, the tools are becoming available so that they can indeed make their language vital, build educational materials to teach their children, provide a community and support for people who want to continue speaking that language. But the natural state of the world is multilingual. There's a joke that says, if you're if you speak two languages, what's it called? Bilingual. If you're speak three languages, it's trilingual. If you speak one language, it's an American. So we're not going to force anybody to not speak a dominant language. In fact, most people will speak a dominant language just because it's economically important. But there's no reason for the Cherokee speakers to give up speaking Cherokee. But all of them do speak English these days, but they keep their culture and their heritage and their self-identity alive by using the Cherokee language. And there are many forces which drive out the native languages, such as housing improvements, which took the children away from living in the same household as their parents and their grandparents. When the housing improvements were made so the grandparents could have their own houses, the use of Cherokee language dropped like a rock because kids weren't living with their grandparents who spoke the language. A whole generation missed the language. With digital technology, we may be able to let people make that decision about what language they want to keep going.
Thank you.
Sure. And just to add a little bit is that, as Craig said, it's a choice. People can have that choice to speak the two languages and the three languages, and they can interact. But if we take it for granted that just because they speak the dominant language, that's it, they're connected to the world, then we're missing out that opportunity of that wealth of experience, whether it's ecological or cultural or whatever it is. It goes away from them as well, not just us. And that's what we're trying to help people retain, that cultural diversity that we all need. So it is important for us as outsiders that if the people want to, retain their language, that we do everything we can to help them.
Hi. I don't know if I have quite a question or it's just a thought, but so my native language is Spanish. And as you know, it's one of the most spoken languages in the world. But when I use the internet, I use it mostly in English, from Wikipedia articles to recipes to academic articles. Everything is better in English. And I just looked it up, and the internet is like 55% is in English. So it's obviously a dominant language. But not only that, but the platforms are built mostly in the US. So for example, I have to type my name without accent marks because it will have an error. And it's, it's Spanish, very close to English, Latin script. So, I mean, my question is how, or, my thought, how much English is a threat to this, to the globalization? English is like, it invades the internet, and, and it's too powerful to, even with Spanish, that's, it's a very, very big language, and I see it threats Spanish. I mean, with these communities with only a few hundred speakers, how do you see that?
Let me just say before other people answer as well that you mentioned, although your question is sociological, you also mentioned issues of internationalization. And in this room, at least, there's so many internationalization engineers, and they understand exactly these problems, right? So we are trying very, very hard to correct all of these things, to educate engineers that are not part of the language industry that, they have to be thinking ahead for the multilingual. So that is part of the effort, which is done today by everybody in this room. So moving forward to your answer about the sociological,
I want to say that today is being recognized both at the World Economic Forum, by UNICEF, by UNESCO, by all the world leading organizations, about the economic disparity that is created today due to the lack of access to information in people's own language. In fact, about 51% of the world doesn't have access to the internet in their own language. But it also is important because it's up to us. Till very few years ago, Thai did not exist on the internet. And I know personally the people who took it upon themselves to digitize Thai language, put Thai language on the map, create machine translation for Thai language, build the information necessary to create meaningful content for Thai community, and actually today internet exists for the Thai community. So it's up to us, up to the linguists, and up to the linguists in every individual community to have that, make that happen. And this particular project allows us to hand a blueprint to the other communities, to the other nations, to languages who have. Some of them have a lot of speakers, like Thai language. There are other languages like that, and help them accelerate that process. So that's where each one of us can make a difference.
I believe that the internet is becoming more diverse. I believe that 10, 15, 20 years ago, there was even more dominance of English on the internet than there is now. So the tools that are available on your phone right now make it possible to type the enyes and the accents. In fact, if you have an Android phone, you can get a hold of 950 different keyboards on Gboard. So if you wonder if your language is supported on Google's Android keyboard, take a look. It may well be there. Now, that means there are 6,000 languages that aren't yet supported on that, but those 950 cover a lot, and most people don't even know. In fact, the Google engineers beg people to try so that their work is going to be recognized, because if only half a dozen people are using one of these keyboards, it's hard for management to agree to do even more. So there are tools out there. I think that we have the technology. One thing, if a website requires you to type your name without accents, or requires your name to be in Latin characters, yell at them and say, wait a minute. My friends in the ADLAM community told me that some social media will not let their names be typed in the ADLAM character set. Why? Because they don't recognize it as valid Unicode. Why? Because it's only been on the Internet Unicode standard for 3 years. Why? Because someone just didn't think that it was necessary. So letting the companies know that this is important is the thing we have to do. That's why it's important. It's not just academics. It's not just people in indigenous communities. It's people working with the industries, people working with technology people, and elderly people who speak the language as well, working with young people. All of these who probably know the technology much better than their parents. Those connections are important. You're right. English is dominant, but I don't think it's going to stay that way.
Thank you.
Hi, I wondered, since Google's involved in the Endangered Languages Project, if you have any collaboration or any kind of sharing of information between this initiative and the Global Lives Project, the Endangered Languages Project?
As a matter of fact, I just had a meeting with the Endangered Languages Project last week, and we talked about an alliance and collaboration or a consortium, and we talked about that not just for the two organizations, but in a broader sense, other global organizations as well. And I know that Google had initially created that alliance, and it is still in existence, but it's not very active. So one of the things that we want to bring out together is now, are the other organizations willing to be more active? And the ones that are going to be willing to be more active, we can all gather together and start actually working with deliverables.
So I heard that some MIS students were involved in it, so you might ask some of them. I had heard that.
Personally, I've been on the governing council of the Endangered Languages Project for several years, and my role is not very important in terms of doing technical work for them, but I am involved to a small extent. I actually did some technical work before it was publicly launched, and we maintain those connections. And that, and Living Tongues, and Wiki Tongues, and other websites that are working hard on indigenous languages are natural candidates for working together. So one of the things that I want to thank Jeanette for is bringing lots of people together who wouldn't have known about each other. Also, I want to thank IMUG, because that's where I first met Jeanette. And Johanna came to an IMUG a few sessions ago and got involved in this. And IMUG has been a force for that. And each of you, by introducing someone who speaks maybe not a dominant language, might be able to extend this further.
Just curious, because you started talking about Switzerland, and I'm Swiss, so I got excited. Very short question. Do you consider Swiss German an indigenous language?
Schweizerdeutsch, and there are probably some people from Switzerland here. Anyone from the Zurich office? Okay, yes. Swiss German. Sure, it's an indigenous language, and it's largely not written. In fact, very few documents are actually written in Swiss German, but it has a language code, and I think it's definitely worth preserving, promoting, and keeping it alive. And it's probably not just one language. There are lots of dialects within individual valleys and communities there. If they consider it an indigenous language and want to keep it going, the tools are there for them to use it. Yes. And when I was there, the one time I've been to Zurich, I tried my terrible German, and I got by better with my passable English than I did in High German there, just because my High German was not as good as their English.
So if there are no more questions, I'd like to make another little announcement. You know that Translation Commons is very grassroots, very organically grown. We are trying to put structures and everything as we're going along, but we are a community. And as such, every day we discover something new. So I wanted to announce that Milla has joined the board of directors of Translation Commons, and Craig and Johanna have joined the advisory boards as leading, the two huge projects for Translation Commons. And I wanted to thank you guys very much and welcome you. Okay, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.